In the heart of a Wyoming winter, when the wind cut like glass and the snow swallowed the horizon, a reclusive Marine veteran spotted movement in the blinding white. A wild Mustang, its coat matted with blood, both hind legs shattered, was dragging itself forward on its forelegs, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between man and horse, and what happened after would defy every instinct, every law of nature, and everything he thought he knew about survival. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Wyoming winter had a way of swallowing the horizon, blurring the line between earth and sky, until the world seemed made of nothing but shifting white. That afternoon, the clouds hung low and heavy, the color of dull steel pressing down on the open land. Wind knifed through the skeletal fence posts that lined the narrow dirt road, rattling loose wires and whistling through old nail holes. Every fence board was crusted in ice, every weed bowed under the weight of snow. Jack Rourke hunched forward over the wheel of his battered '93 Ford pickup, its heater coughing a tired breath that did little against the creeping chill. The truck rattled over frozen ruts, tires crunching through layers of packed snow as it followed the winding path back toward the abandoned ranch he'd been calling home. Once Jack had lived among men, noise and orders shouted over chaos. 12 years in the Marine Corps, half of them in combat zones that never made the evening news, had left him with a body that ached in storms and a mind that sought distance from people. After the IED blast that ended his career, he'd traded barracks for silence, choosing the isolation of a rundown ranch on the edge of nowhere. The radio hissed in the background, a no AA weather warning cutting through static blizzard conditions. Visibility near zero. All unnecessary travel is discouraged. The wind roared so hard, it almost drowned the voice out, rattling the truck's thin doors. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel and kept his eyes on the narrow corridor of road still visible ahead. By the time he crossed the old cattle guard, the storm had gathered strength. Snow hammered the windshield in a relentless barrage, each flake a needle in the flood of the wind. The horizon had vanished entirely. Beyond the next fence post, the world was nothing but a blinding white wall. He eased his foot off the gas. Even crawling along at 15 miles an hour felt too fast in this weather. One wrong move, one hidden patch of ice, and the truck could spin into the ditch, or worse, the creek, now buried beneath a crust of snow. On his left, the fence wavered in and out of view. On his right stretched an open field where the wind sculpted shifting drifts, each one deep enough to trap him until spring. The cab felt smaller, tighter. In storms like this, the isolation pressed harder. A reminder that out here, help was hours away, if it came at all. He scanned the whiteness ahead, muscles tense with the quiet readiness of a man who'd lived too long in dangerous places. That was when he saw it. A shadow moved against the snow, low and awkward, not the bounding gait of a deer or the hunched shuffle of a cow. It was crawling. Jack blinked, thinking maybe the storm was playing tricks on his eyes. The shape wavered in the swirling gusts, then staggered forward a few feet before collapsing into the drift. Snow began covering it almost immediately, like the land was intent on swallowing it whole. His foot hovered over the brake. Logic told him to keep driving to get back before the road closed completely. But something older than logic, a tug in the gut that had saved his life more than once, made him slow the truck to a stop. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the form through the blur of white. When the wind shifted just enough to clear his view, his breath caught. It was a horse. Not just any horse, a Mustang, lean and wild, its coat, a deep, sun-baked bay beneath the ice, and blood crusting its flank. Its black mane hung in tangled ropes plastered against a neck mottled with frost. Steam burst from its nostrils in short, ragged plumes. Jack shoved the gear into park and stepped out the cold, hitting him like a slap. Snow stung his cheeks and found the gap at his collar. He trudged toward the animal boots, breaking through the crusted drifts with muffled crunches. As he closed the distance, the damage became clearer. Both hind legs were twisted at unnatural angles, the fur matted with dried blood and frozen mud. The animal's weight shifted forward onto its front legs as it dragged itself a few painful inches at a time, shoulders trembling with the effort. Every movement left a streak of red in the snow. But it wasn't the injuries that rooted Jack to the spot. It was the eyes. Even through the storm, the Mustang's gaze locked onto his. Not the wide-eyed panic he'd seen in livestock, nor the dull resignation of broken creatures. This was different. There was pain, yes, but also a fierce, unyielding spark defiance against whatever had brought it here to die. Jack knew that look. He'd seen it in the dust and smoke of a foreign battlefield, in the face of a friend who refused to let go, no matter how bad the odds. The wind howled between them, carrying a spindrift that stung his eyes. But Jack didn't look away. Somewhere beneath the frozen crust of his self-imposed exile, something shifted. He couldn't leave it here. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough in the cold air. "Easy, boy." He moved slowly, circling to its side so it could see him at all times. His hands were already stiff from the cold, but he forced them to work the latch on the truck's toolbox. From inside, he pulled a folded emergency blanket, bright orange against the white snow, and a length of braided rope. The Mustang's ears flicked back, then forward again, nostrils flaring as he stepped closer. It didn't try to lunge away, only shifted its weight and blew out a long, hot breath that rose in the cold like smoke. "That's it," Jack said quietly, keeping his tone steady. "Not here to hurt you." He eased the blanket over the horse's withers, letting the fabric settle before drawing it around the shoulders. The animal shivered, but didn't resist, only tilted its head slightly as if gauging the man's intent. Working quickly, Jack looped the rope in a crude breast collar around the front of the animal, careful to avoid the twisted legs. Then, bracing himself against the wind, he began the slow, brutal job of leading it toward the truck. Each step was a battle. The snow came to mid-calf, and every time the Mustang's forelegs sank into the drift, it had to heave itself forward with a grunt of effort. Jack walked backward, tugging gently but firmly, speaking to it in the same low tone he'd once used with frightened recruits. The storm swallowed them both, wind tearing at the blanket, snow biting at their skin. But inch by inch they moved man and horse through the white void toward the faint shadow of the pickup waiting on the road. And though Jack would later tell himself he'd acted on instinct in that moment, he knew something else was at work. That connection, the silent exchange, and that first locked glance had made the choice for him. By the time Jack wrestled the Mustang to the edge of the road, the storm had only grown more vicious. The truck's bed was already collecting a layer of snow despite the tailgate being closed. He yanked it down and spread an old foam pad across the metal, topping it with a folded wool blanket and the crinkling orange of another rescue sheet. The bright color was an ugly contrast against the bay's dark coat, but warmth was the only priority now. He worked the rope into a makeshift sling, looping it under the animal's chest and tightening it against the broad muscles of its shoulders. With the wind at his back, he heaved upward, guiding the Mustang's front half onto the pad. The horse grunted once, a deep sound of pain and protest, but didn't thrash. Jack planted his boots in the snow and shoved from behind, careful not to let the hindquarters bear any real weight. It was an ugly process. Minutes that felt like hours. But at last, The Mustang was curled awkwardly in the bed legs, folded beneath as best they could be. Jack threw another blanket over it, tucked the ends under, then slammed the tailgate shut. On the drive back, the world beyond the windshield was an unbroken white tunnel. Jack kept the speed low, easing over the hidden dips in the road to avoid jolting the animal further. Every so often, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The horse was lying still, except for the trembling of its shoulders. Steam still curled from its nostrils. No cry of pain, no frantic kicking, just that same watchful, silent endurance. When the ranch finally came into sight, a crooked silhouette against the snow, Jack pulled into the yard and cut the engine. The wind instantly claimed the silence, moaning through the boards of the old barn. He climbed into the bed, speaking low again. "Easy. We're here." The Mustang shifted its head toward his voice ears, twitching against the cold. The barn wasn't much. Once it had held cattle. Now it was a shell with half a roof, leaning walls and stalls that hadn't seen an animal in years. But the frame was still sturdy. Jack led the horse into the nearest stall, the rope slack between them, letting it choose each step. Rotted boards groaned under their weight. Inside, he shoved a few bales of old straw into a corner, spreading them thick underfoot. From a side shed, he fetched spare planks and nailed them over the worst gaps in the wall, the hammering half lost to the wind. A burlap sack nailed across the stall opening served as a windbreak. In the far corner, he set a small kerosene heater and struck a match. The flame flickered, caught, and began spilling warmth into the frigid air. It was a poor refuge, but compared to the storm outside, it might as well have been a fortress. The moan of the wind faded to a dull background murmur, broken only by the sound of the horse's breathing. Jack fetched a bucket of warm water from the stove in the main house and a thick towel crouching beside the Mustang. Up close, the smell of wet hair iron from the blood and the faint sourness of fear hung in the air. He began working the towel along the neck and shoulders, and the heat from the water loosening the icy crust. Brown mud streaked with red bled away under his hands. As the layers melted, the injuries revealed themselves. Long, shallow scrapes along the hocks, patches of fur rubbed down to bare skin, swelling around the joints. But what made him pause was the ring-shaped chafing above each fetlock, a raw band, scabbed in places exactly where a rope would bite if it were cinched tight for too long. Jack's frown deepened. He'd seen rope burns on horses before, but these weren't fresh. They were the kind of wounds that came from days of confinement, not hours. He worked down to the hocks, brushing aside the last of the matted hair, and his gut twisted. Across the gaskin muscle, just above the knee, was a bruise the size of his hand, striped as if something had struck with a flat surface, but left edges. There was a matching mark on the other leg, and the skin split in places where the blow had broken through. This wasn't a fall, wasn't ice, wasn't anything nature would do. He sat back on his heels, breath fogging the air. Images surfaced, rumors he'd heard in the feed store about Kane Livestock, the private yard up north, where horses went in healthy and came out broken in body and mind. Whispers about men who trained Mustangs for rodeo stock, making them mean enough to thrill a crowd. Jack's jaw clenched. His first instinct was the old one, fix the problem at the source. But that was another life, and charging into a fight half-cocked was a good way to get killed, or worse, get the horse killed. For now, there was only one thing to do: keep the animal alive until help could arrive. He straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and crossed to the corner where an old phone hung from a nail. He flipped through a stained notepad until he found the number he wanted: Emily Hayes. She'd been the vet who showed up one autumn morning 2 years ago when a lost Mustang had wandered into Jack's yard. They hadn't spoken much since, but he trusted her to know the right questions and, more importantly, the right people. The line clicked after 2 rings. "Hayes." "It's Jack Rourke," he said, skipping pleasantries. "I've got a Mustang. Bad shape." "Both hinds," he hesitated, glancing at the horse. "Both hinds are busted up. Rope burns, old bruising. Looks deliberate." Her voice sharpened instantly. "Where are you, home?" "Found him in the blizzard. He's in the barn now. I've got heat and straw, but he's not putting any weight on the back legs. I can't get there until this lets up," she said. And he could hear the frustration under the professionalism. "Keep him warm. Don't move him more than you have to. If there's any fresh bleeding, pack it with clean cloth. And Jack, watch yourself. If this is what I think it is, someone's going to want him back." "Yeah," he said softly. "I figured." They hung up. Jack pulled another wool blanket from a trunk in the tack room and draped it over the horse, tucking it under the chest. He spread fresh straw in the stall until the floor was thick with it, then leaned back against one of the posts. The Mustang's breathing had slowed, its head, drooping eyes half-lidded, but still tracking his movements. The heater's glow painted the wood in flickering amber. Outside, the blizzard clawed at the walls, but inside, for now, there was only the creak of the rafters and the soft rustle of straw. Jack folded his arms and let his eyes close, not fully asleep, but far enough to drift. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that the animal in front of him had been hurt by human hands and that leaving it to die in the snow had never been an option. By the time the sky began to pale behind the hills, the worst of the storm had blown itself east. The world outside was muffled in white. Every fence post capped every tree limb, heavy with snow. Jack was still in the stall, his back against the post, when the low crunch of tires broke the morning quiet. He rose stiffly, brushing straw from his coat, and stepped to the doorway in time to see a silver SUV rolling carefully up the drive. Emily Hayes climbed out, slamming the door against the wind. She was bundled in a thick parka with a fur-lined hood, a wool scarf tucked high under her chin. In one gloved hand, she carried a battered veterinary kit that looked like it had seen more winter pastures than clinics. Her boots left sharp prints in the snow as she crossed to the barn. Morning, she called, her breath fogging in the cold. Jack nodded her inside. "Glad you could make it." She ducked through the stall doorway, and her expression shifted instantly, part surprise, part worry. The Mustang lifted his head from the straw ears, turning toward her. The heater still hummed in the corner, throwing a circle of soft warmth. Jack gave her the short version, finding the horse in the storm, the way it had collapsed in the snow, the injuries he'd seen while cleaning it up. Emily knelt beside the animal without another word, already unzipping her kit. She worked methodically. A small penlight flickered in her hand as she checked each eye for clarity, pried the lips back to inspect teeth, and then moved down the forelegs with steady pressure from fingertips to fetlock. The Mustang tolerated it, though his ears flicked back whenever she pressed a tender spot. When she reached the hindquarters, Emily paused to take photos, close-ups of the bruises and rope burns, a few wider shots for context. Jack watched her brow crease beneath the shadow of her hood. Then her fingers brushed the base of the horse's neck, moving down toward the shoulder. She stopped. "There," she murmured. With the tip of her glove, she parted the fur to reveal a small, perfectly round scar, high on the left shoulder, pale against the darker coat. Jack crouched to see. "What is it, Freeze brand?" Emily said. "BLM uses them to mark wild horses they capture. This one's faint, but I've seen the pattern before." She pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly before tapping into an internal database. Bureau of Land Management keeps digital records of every branded Mustang. If we're lucky, this one's still in the system. She held the phone over the scar, snapped a clear shot, and began entering details: coat color, approximate age, sex. After a few minutes, her thumb stilled. Got him. 7-year-old stallion gelded during holding out of the Red Basin herd in Carbon County. She angled the screen toward Jack. A younger, healthier version of the horse stared back from a government intake photo. The eyes were the same. Jack felt a tug in his chest. So he's not just some stray. No, Emily said quietly. He's got a file. And a hell of a bad turn. She settled back on her heels and told him what the record didn't: how a few months ago the BLM had rounded up nearly 100 Red Basin Mustangs under the justification of reducing herd numbers. Many were shipped to long-term holding or adopted out. But some, she said, ended up at auction, where private operations could buy them in bulk. Kane Livestock picked up at least a dozen from that group, she said. And if this boy's injuries are anything to go by, he was one of them. Jack had heard the name. Kane's outfit had a reputation for turning wild horses into rodeo broncs, using methods that would never pass inspection if anyone was allowed to watch. They trained them hard, broke them harder, and sold the survivors at a profit. As Emily spoke, the Mustang's ears twitched. She said the name Kane again while describing the auction, and this time the reaction was unmistakable. The horse flinched, muscles tightening under his coat. His head shot up, eyes wide, and he backed 2 steps until his haunches brushed the stall wall. The air filled with the sharp clap of a hoof striking the floor. Jack moved in, palm resting lightly against the horse's neck. "Easy," he murmured, voice low. He kept talking nonsense words, just the sound of reassurance, until the tension began to bleed from the animal's frame. Even then, the ears stayed half-pinned, the eyes locked warily on Emily. She gave a slow shake of her head. That's not coincidence. He knows exactly what that name means. Jack kept his hand on the horse, feeling the steadying rhythm return to its breathing. After a moment, he stepped back, studying the animal. The bruises, the storm, the way it had kept moving on 2 legs when it should have gone down something in him, refused to call it just luck. "I'm giving him a name," Jack said finally. Emily glanced up from repacking her kit. "What, Valor?" He said it once, testing the sound. Because that's what it takes to go through what he has and still be standing. He tried it again, a little louder, "Valor." The Mustang's ears flicked forward, head tipping slightly, as if catching the word. Jack felt the corner of his mouth lift. Emily's smile was small but genuine, better than a number on a file. "Suits him." Jack stayed where he was, the heater humming, the storm quiet outside. He kept saying the name in different tones, soft, firm, almost conversational. Each time the ears twitched, the head moved a fraction, like the horse was tucking it away somewhere in the long memory that all survivors seem to have. In that stall, surrounded by patched walls and drifting straw, Jack felt the strangest certainty settle over him. He'd found Valor in the middle of nowhere in a storm that should have killed them both. And now, with Emily confirming where the horse had come from and what he'd endured, the sense that this was chance felt more and more like something else entirely. Fate, maybe. Or just 2 stubborn creatures, one human, one horse, crossing paths at the only moment they both could survive it. The days after Emily's visit settled into a rhythm of quiet labor. Snow still clung to the pastures outside, the drifts glittering under brittle sunlight. But inside the old barn, it was warmer now. Straw-replaced drafts blocked the little heater humming. Valor had stopped trembling when he stood, though his back legs still carried weight cautiously, almost as if he expected pain with every step. Every morning and evening, Jack went through the same ritual. He'd fill a bucket with warm water, set out clean bandages and antiseptic, and speak softly as he unwrapped the stained gauze. "Easy now," he'd murmur, crouching beside him. The Mustang would stand still, flanks rising and falling eyes tracking Jack's movements. Jack had learned to read the tiny cues, an ear flick before a shift in weight, the slight tightening of muscle before a wince. When the work was done, he'd settle on the overturned feed bucket by the gate phone in hand. Sometimes he scrolled through the news. Other times he just tapped idly, letting his voice drift in the air. He wasn't sure if Valor understood the words, but the cadence seemed to calm him. More and more, the stallion leaned forward to sniff his open palm whiskers, brushing over calloused skin. Jack found himself lingering longer after each treatment, reluctant to break the quiet connection. One late afternoon, the wind rattling the loose siding outside, Jack sat cross-legged on the straw, his phone balanced in his hand. He'd pulled up a satellite map tracing potential routes into town for lumber and fresh feed. His finger followed the thin gray lines of roads when he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Valor had stepped closer, neck extended, eyes fixed not on him, but on the phone's screen. Jack turned the device, slightly curious. The horse's gaze locked on a section of the map, an irregular patch of pale tan against the surrounding green of fields. Slowly, almost deliberately, Valor's muzzle nudged forward until it touched the glass. Jack frowned. "What's got your attention?" He scrolled the map eastward. Valor's ears flicked back. His head drew away. Jack reversed the motion, bringing the tan patch back into view. The reaction was instant, the ears forward again, a soft stamp of a hoof on the barn floor, a low rumble deep in the chest. Intrigued, Jack zoomed in. The resolution sharpened to reveal outbuildings, fenced enclosures, and a rectangular roof painted in a stark, weather-resistant red. 2 days later, the pattern repeated. Jack, testing the theory, swiped through a folder of images he'd taken around the county fences, open pasture grain silos. Valor ignored them all until one photo appeared, a weather-worn chain-link fence, and just beyond it, that same red-painted door. The stallion gave a sharp exhale, pawed once at the ground, and fixed Jack with an unblinking stare. At first, Jack dismissed it as coincidence. Horses noticed shapes, colors, and movement. Maybe red just caught his eye. But after the third and fourth time, the doubt crept in. He printed the satellite view on paper, laid it flat on the stalled gate, and waited. Valor approached without hesitation, muzzle hovering over the same spot, nostrils flaring. Jack marked the area with a pen. When he cross-checked the boundaries, his stomach tightened. The location sat at the edge of land, listed under Kane Livestock. The connection to Emily's warning and to Valor's earlier panic at the mention of Silas Kane was too pointed to ignore. That evening, when Emily stopped by to drop off more antiseptic wrap, Jack told her. She listened without interrupting, brows drawn together. "If you're right," she said at last, "he might be remembering where they kept him. Maybe even where others still are." Others, Emily leaned on the stall door. If Kane's still holding horses from that roundup, they could be in the same place. And if conditions are anything like what Valor went through? She trailed off, letting the implications settle. "But you have to be careful, Jack. If Kane suspects you're digging, he'll clear everything out before anyone can act. Evidence gone, horses gone." Jack didn't argue. She was right. But the thought of more animals enduring what Valor had endured gnawed at him. In the days that followed, the strange communication continued. Jack would sometimes test it, sliding photos across his screen while sitting in the straw. Most got no reaction. But the moment that red-doored building appeared, Valor's focus sharpened his ears, angling forward like a compass needle finding north. It wasn't random. Jack found himself watching Valor as much as the other way around. He noticed how the stallion mirrored him. On mornings when Jack's mind churned with unease, Valor shifted restlessly, tail flicking. When Jack let his breathing slow and his voice drop, the horse seemed to settle too, eyes softening, muscles easing. It went beyond training, beyond the ordinary trust between man and animal. Jack had worked with horses before, but this was different, more like an unspoken current running between them. Sometimes he thought Valor could read what he was about to do before he moved. He remembered the first moment in the blizzard, the locked gaze in the swirling snow, and wondered if the connection had started there, or if it had been waiting for them long before that night. One evening, as the sky turned lavender over the snowfields, Jack rested his forearms on the stall door. "If you're trying to tell me something," he said quietly, "I hear you." Valor stood squarely before him, eyes level, ears forward. No movement, no sound but their breathing. Jack straightened, resolve settling in. Coincidence or not, the map, the red door, the tension. When Kane's name came up, he wasn't going to ignore it. The storm had brought them together, but maybe the real reason was standing right in front of him, a survivor pointing the way to those still trapped. And Jack knew one thing: whatever dangers lay in that direction, he'd follow. The morning came, brittle and cold, the kind where frost clung stubbornly to every surface, and the air bit at skin like glass splinters. Jack was halfway through mucking out Valor's stall, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel and the soft rustle of fresh straw, the only sounds in the barn, when the low rumble of an engine carried in from the road. It wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder until it stopped just outside the front gate. Jack set the shovel aside, brushing straw from his gloves, and stepped to the barn door. Through the haze of his own breath, he saw a heavy-duty pickup idling in the drive, its chrome bumper catching the weak winter sun. The driver's door swung open. A tall man climbed down broad through the shoulders, his frame filling the doorway, before his boots even touched the ground. A scuffed leather coat hung heavy over his form, the hem brushing against jeans tucked into dusty boots. A dark Stetson shadowed most of his face. But when he stepped forward, Jack caught the glint of pale eyes, hard and cold. The man's gait was steady but not smooth. There was a faint hitch in his right step, as if one knee didn't bend the way it used to. When he reached the fence, he took off his glove and extended a hand, in a gesture that might have been polite, if not for the weight behind it. "Cole Barrett," he said, his voice slow, measured. "I manage Kane Livestock." Jack didn't take the hand. He let the name hang in the cold air, watching the man's expression. Cole smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I hear tell my boss has misplaced something of value. A Mustang. Big dark-eyed fellow. Word is you've got him." Jack leaned on the top rail. "The horse I've got was half dead in a snowstorm when I found him. No brand papers, no proof he belongs to anybody. He's not going anywhere." Cole's gaze slid past him toward the open barn. He stepped closer, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground, and stopped in the shadow of the doorway. From there, he could see Valor. The stallion's reaction was instant. His ears shot forward, then flattened tight against his skull. His breath came hard and loud, fogging in the frigid air. He backed into the far corner of the stall, hooves drumming against the plank floor in a sharp, nervous rhythm. Cole's eyes narrowed. "Well, look at that. Seems he remembers me." Jack shifted just enough to block his line of sight. He remembers something all right. The smile faded. Cole's voice dropped half an octave. "My boss doesn't like losing property, and he really doesn't like folks hanging on to it." He stepped in closer, close enough for Jack to smell the faint tang of tobacco and cold leather. "Out here, Accidents happen. Roads or slick fences break. Sometimes, people disappear. Jack held his gaze unmoving. Cole's breath fogged between them before he leaned back. "I'll let him know you send your regards." The tone was almost casual, but every word was a hook. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back to the truck with that same measured limp. A moment later, the engine growled, and the pickup rolled away its taillights, winking once before vanishing around the bend. Jack didn't move until the sound was gone. Behind him, Valor snorted, the muscles along his neck still tight. Jack stepped into the stall, resting a hand on the horse's shoulder until the tremors eased. "He's not touching you again," he said quietly. That afternoon, while replacing a loose hinge on the gate, Jack caught movement far down the dirt road. A black SUV sat half off, the shoulder engine off, but headlights glowing dimly through the winter haze. From this distance, he couldn't make out faces, if there were any, but the vehicle didn't budge. He stood there a long moment, watching until the door to the house banged softly in the wind. The sound must have carried. The SUV eased backward, turning slowly before disappearing down the track. Unease coiled low in his gut. He'd seen that kind of patience before, in other places, other lives. The next layer came at night. Jack was making a final check of the property before turning in the beam of his flashlight, cutting long white lines across the snow. Near Valor's stall, his boot hit something softer than frozen earth. He angled the light down. Footprints. They circled the barn, pressed deep into the snowpack, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. Whoever had left them had walked too close to Valor's stall, and then turned back toward the road. The soldier in him, and the one he'd tried to bury under months of quiet, came alive. This wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance. The next morning, he made changes. First, the stall door, reinforcing the latch with a length of chain and a heavy padlock, then adding a crossbar cut from solid oak. After that, he dug out a high-powered floodlight from the shed, mounting it on the barn's outer wall. The motion sensor was sensitive enough that a rabbit could set it off. That was fine by him. In the house, he pulled an old 12-gauge from the back of the closet, setting it on the kitchen table. The cleaning kit came next, his hands moving with the same muscle memory that had kept his weapon sand-free in desert heat. Every patch, every oiled pass through the barrel was deliberate, the metallic clicks of reassembly echoing softly in the quiet room. By the time he snapped the shotgun closed, the last light of day was draining from the sky. He stood at the kitchen window, looking toward the barn. Valor's silhouette shifted inside the sound of hooves on straw, carrying faintly across the yard. Jack wasn't the only one on edge. The stallion had been lifting his head at every distant engine note, ears pivoting toward the road. More than once, Jack had found him standing at the front of the stall, staring into the dark, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. "Not tonight," Jack said aloud, though he wasn't sure if the words were for Valor or for himself. The cold deepened, and the wind picked up, rattling the loose sheet metal on the old outbuilding. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked. Jack stayed at the window, his eyes on the road, his mind ticking over each choice he'd made since the storm. The connection to Valor, the map, Kane's name, it had all pulled him into something that was no longer just about saving one horse. Now it was about keeping him alive. And Jack had no illusions men like Cole didn't knock twice before they took what they wanted. The night after Cole Barrett's visit was quieter than Jack expected, but not in a way that brought relief. It was the kind of quiet that hummed under the skin, the stillness before a branch cracks in the dark. Valor paced more than usual, his hoofbeats muffled by straw, but steady enough that Jack heard them through the barn walls as he made coffee. By the time Emily pulled up the next evening, The last of the daylight was fading from the sky. Her SUV crunched over the gravel headlights, sweeping across the barn doors before she killed the engine. She stepped out bundled in a thick coat, a knitted scarf wound high around her neck. The moment she saw Jack's face, she frowned. "What happened?" she asked, glancing toward the barn. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her inside. Valor lifted his head at the sound of the door ears swiveling toward her voice. But there was tension in the way he shifted his weight. Emily's eyes narrowed. "You both look like you've been waiting for something bad to happen," she said. Jack told her everything: Cole's arrival, his deliberate mention of Kane, the way Valor had reacted like a live wire. He spoke about the SUV on the road, the footprints in the snow, the sense that someone was watching not just him, but the horse. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression tightening with every detail. When he finished, she pulled off her gloves and rubbed her hands together. "You can't just keep locking the barn at night and expect this to go away," she said. "Silas Kane has friends in every corner of this county. If you push back on your own, he'll find a way to make you disappear metaphorically or otherwise." "I'm not giving Valor back," Jack said flatly. "I didn't say you should," Emily replied. "But if you want to keep him and yourself safe, we need someone who can go after Kane from the right angle. I know a woman, Agent Claire Monroe, Federal Wildlife Crimes Division. She's tough and she's thorough. If anyone can build a case that sticks, it's her." Jack hesitated. "And you trust her with my life," Emily said. "We worked together on a Mustang poaching case a couple years back. She doesn't move without evidence, but once she has it, she doesn't stop." She pulled her phone from her coat and stepped toward the far end of the barn, scrolling through contacts until she found the name. The call connected on the second ring. Monroe came a woman's voice, brisk, steady. "It's Emily Hayes," she said. "I've got a situation. It's about Kane livestock." Jack couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could read the shift in Emily's posture, the way she squared her shoulders. She gave Monroe the essentials: the Mustang with the injuries, the reaction to Kane's name, the possible location tied to that red door in the photograph. When she hung up, she met Jack's eyes. She's interested. And she's coming. Claire Monroe arrived the next morning in an unmarked black SUV that bore the same no-nonsense presence she carried herself. She stepped out wearing a field jacket and tactical boots, a camera slung over one shoulder, and a thick binder tucked under her arm. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, her gaze sweeping the property in a single assessing pass before landing on Jack. "You must be Rourke," she said by way of greeting. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel thread running through it. Jack nodded, leading her into the barn. Valor's ears pricked as they entered, but he didn't retreat the way he had with Cole. Monroe stopped several paces short of the stall, pulling her camera free. "May I?" she asked. Jack gave a nod, and she moved with slow, deliberate steps, photographing the scars along Valor's legs, the chafing marks at his ankles, the discoloration on his hide, where old wounds had healed unevenly. She jotted quick notes in a small notebook, her handwriting a neat, utilitarian script. Emily joined them halfway through. "Tell her about the map," she prompted Jack. He explained Valor's unusual reaction, how the horse had fixated on a specific section of the satellite map, and how he'd repeated the behavior when shown photographs of a red-doored structure. Monroe's attention sharpened. "Show me," she said. Jack retrieved the printed map from a drawer in the tack room and laid it across a feed bin. Monroe leaned over it, her finger tracing the boundary lines, until she stopped at the circle Jack had drawn. "That's interesting," she murmured. "I've had eyes on Kane for a while. This spot lines up with one of his lesser-known properties. not his main ranch, too public, but a side facility on private land. Locals call it the North Shed. Red metal door, corrugated siding. Supposed to be for feed storage, but I've heard rumors about a basement level. The kind you don't put on any blueprint. Emily crossed her arms. Rumors about what happens down there. Monroe met her gaze. Training, she said, her tone flat. The kind that breaks horses fast. Sometimes for bucking competitions, sometimes for private fights. None of it legal. Jack felt his jaw tighten. Why hasn't anyone gone in? Because nobody will talk, Monroe said. No photos, no witnesses willing to testify. And without probable cause, no judge is going to sign a warrant. That's the hole we're stuck in. She closed the binder she'd been carrying and looked at him squarely. You found a horse that may have been there. That's more than I've ever gotten. But for this to hold up in court, I need proof connecting Valor's injuries to that property and to Kane. And getting that proof means getting close. Jack glanced toward the stall. Valor stood watching them, his dark eyes, steady ears tilted toward the sound of their voices. Jack remembered the snow swirling that night and the way the horse's gaze had locked with his through the storm. If I help you, he said slowly, what does that look like? It looks like risk, Monroe replied. Kane will know someone's been nosing around. If he suspects you're working with me, you'll have more than a black SUV parked down the road. I can't protect you from every move he makes. The warning hung in the cold air, but Jack didn't flinch. I'm not walking away, he said. Emily didn't speak, but the set of her jaw was all the answer he needed. Whatever came next, she wasn't letting him go at it alone. Monroe gave a single short nod. Then let's get to work. The night they chose had no moon. The sky was a deep, lightless vault, and the kind of winter dark that made distances collapse and sound travel strange. Temperatures had slipped well below freezing. Each breath crystallized and fell away in a faint glitter. Claire Monroe checked the time on her watch, then the wind direction with a wetted fingertip, and nodded once as if the weather itself had cooperated with her plan. Tonight, she said. Jack had dug his old field jacket from the back of a closet, the fabric stiff with stored years and the smell of oil and canvas. He'd added a wool cap, fingerless gloves under a pair of leather ones, and laced his boots tight. On the bench seat between them lay a compact set of binoculars, a DSLR with a telephoto lens wrapped in a dark sock to kill any shine, and a small audio recorder with a dead cat windscreen. He'd forgotten how familiar this pre-mission quiet felt, the surge of focus that narrowed everything down to tasks, angles, timing. They took his truck lights off as they left the county road for a barely there track that tunneled between stands of leafless willow. 2 kilometers out from Kane's property, Monroe tapped the dash. Here. Jack coasted into a shallow hollow lined with snow-bruised sage and killed the engine. The world rushed back in dry wind through frozen weeds, the tick of cooling metal, the faint creak of ice in the creek a field away. Monroe slung a small pack across her back and handed Jack a strip of matte tape. Over the camera logo, she said, reflective paints can bounce from a mile off when a beam hits right. He pressed the tape down and shouldered the camera. Rules of movement, he asked, though the answer was muscle memory. Low, slow, no skylining, she said. And if you even think you hear dogs, we freeze. They walked with their heads down, and their senses stretched thin boots, placing carefully to avoid the crisp, betrayingly loud crust of drifted snow. Jack took the lead along a shallow drainage that made a natural trench, then angled up through a swale to a knoll he'd scouted on satellite view earlier, a low hump with a line of scrub that would break their silhouette. From there, the land fell away toward Kane's side property. They crawled the last few feet. When they slid their binoculars up, the facility filled their view like a stage under harsh light. A chain-link perimeter fence, topped with barbed coils, made a hard square against the fields. Inside, floodlights on tall poles washed the yards and buildings in a hard industrial glare. In the center stood a long corrugated metal barn. The main door, Jack didn't need a second look to know it was painted a dense flat red that sucked whatever warmth the light could offer and turned it sinister. Shift workers moved inside the fence line in slow arcs, their flashlights jittering like fireflies domesticated into obedience. Every so often, a radio squawk broke the air, a burst of coded static and clipped words. Jack watched the rhythm for a while, noting gaps, overlaps, the lazy turns where backtracking opened blind patches. He murmured the counts into the small recorder, then copied them into a pocket notebook by Fieldgate Patrol. 2 men, 6-minute loop. Northwest corner static post with radio checks at 15. Document entrances and egress, Monroe whispered. Main gate 2 truck lanes keypad, Jack said, peering. Back service gate locked chain looks ornamental. Personnel door on east wall of the red barn. Another on the west, less used. Windows. He paused. Wait. On the ground level, tucked along the barn's lower edge, where snow drifted and light fell poorly, were several rectangular grates. At first glance, they looked like nothing. Jack dialed focus and breathed out slowly. Vents, he said. Bigger than they need for a normal barn. Monroe eased closer, her shoulder brushing his. Angle horizontal. Low. Like they're pulling air from somewhere that isn't on this level. As if to prove the point, a faint ghost of steam lifted from one grate and vanished, torn to shreds by the wind. Jack watched another vent pulse, a regular exhale, steady as sleep. He closed his eyes and let his other senses catch up. There, beneath the hum of the big lights and the intermittent crackle of radios, something else. A deep mechanical whir. Not a heater. A fan. Industrial grade. Monroe's mouth flattened. Sub-level ventilation. She clicked the audio recorder on and held it out, capturing the ambient thrum. This matches what a former ranch hand described, she murmured. Could never get him to testify. Quit and skipped state the week after. Jack tracked the barn's western shadow. Backside, he said. I want to see the foundation. They belly crawled along the contour of the knoll until they had a slantwise view of the building's rear. Here the flood lighting was thinner, a practical oversight where no one expected cameras. Set just at grade like the windows of a basement no one wanted to admit existed, ran a line of narrow openings. Each was barred. Old iron, no new steel square stock, welded clean. And then the sound came sliding under the fan's drone and reaching farther than Jack thought possible. The hammering of hooves. Not one horse. Many. The beat varied, panic restraint. The ugly syncopation of animals fighting chains. A high stifled whinny cut off too fast. Another followed lower, roar, a sound Jack felt along his spine before it reached his ears. Monroe lifted the recorder again and set it near the ground where the vibrations carried. She took a timestamp and then another. This is good, she breathed. Indirect, but good. A prosecutor can work with this if we can link the audio to the site with imagery. Imagery we're about to get, Jack said. He wiped a thin film of ice from the telephoto lens and began shooting. The red door, framed tight with the keypad panel visible and the security camera above, click. A guard passed the shape of a long coiled strap click. One vent shuddering breath slow steam click. The barred windows, a row of shadows, with the faintest suggestion of movement behind two click click. The wind knifed at his exposed fingers. He shifted to keep his elbows planted and his body behind the knoll's last scrub to cut glare. The DSLR's shutter was damped, but even so he timed shots with gusts, radio squelches footsteps. He moved methodically from detail to detail, letting the story of the place tell itself: infrastructure for air, architecture for confinement, humans for control. Monroe passed him a spare memory card without taking her eyes off the facility. "Swap," she whispered. Redundancy. He slid the fresh card in and tucked the first, now crowded with images, into a small waterproof pouch that she stuffed into an inner pocket. She was already writing the date and time on a label with a grease pencil. They lay quiet for another 10 minutes, collecting the last of what they needed: a pair of workers carrying a plastic storage bin between them, something inside jangling. A handler stepping out the red door with a riding crop tucked under one arm. A third man smoking below a no smoking sign, head down, boots scraping idle circles in the hard dirt like he had all the time in the world. "Let's go," Monroe said. They backed away the way they'd come, sliding on elbows until the knoll's shoulder hid them, then crouching to a low run along the drainage line. Jack kept his weight forward, feet placing on grass clumps rather than the brittle crust. The cold sharpened everything: the smell of metal from the floodlights, the far-off taint of manure. At the drainage's shallow bend, Monroe lifted a hand, and they stopped as one. She listened, head cocked. Jack felt it a second later, the faint bass tremor of a large engine coming awake somewhere close and not within the fence line. He peered back the way they'd come. Nothing visible. He looked forward to the black seam of the two-track lane where they'd abandoned the truck. "Pick up," he said, too soft to fog the air. "On the lane." "Keep moving," Monroe said. "No lights? If they're fishing, we give them nothing." They moved. The ground underfoot began to slope gently downward toward the track. Snow squeaked now with each step, loud in the hush. They were 300, maybe 400 meters from the truck when the dark erupted in twin cones of hard white light. Headlamps switched on with theatrical timing, flared straight into their faces, bleaching the world to glare. A second set snapped onto the left flanking. Jack's eyes watered and narrowed. He lifted a hand to shade them, ready for the next move. The driver's door of the nearest pickup opened, and a familiar broad-shouldered silhouette stepped down. Cole Barrett planted both boots like a man who already owned the ground. Two more figures unfolded from the second vehicle, big men, the casual thickness of shoulders that came from ranch work and not the gym, each carrying a heavy flashlight and something long and blunt in the other hand. Cole's smile had no warmth. "Evening," he called, his voice sliding easily across the cold. "Hell of a night for a stroll. But I'll tell you, this particular stretch isn't much for sightseeing." Jack said nothing. He shifted half a step so he stood between Monroe and the men without seeming to. His right hand hooked through the camera strap. The weight of the telephoto lens felt suddenly like a liability and a weapon all at once. One of the heavies angled closer, beams slashing across Monroe's pack. "What's in the bag?" he asked, as if he were a bored cop and they were kids out past curfew. Monroe's posture didn't change. "Lunch," she said. Cole laughed. "Lady, you're funny." He took 3 slow steps forward. The light off his truck set a rim of glare along his jaw. "Now here's the thing. My boss cares a great deal about his privacy, and I care about making sure no one violates it. So I'm going to ask you to put that camera down and hand over anything you've been playing with on that hill." "And if we don't?" Jack asked. Cole's eyes thinned. "Then we go for a walk together. You tell me what you were looking at. We compare notes. Maybe we find out we have a lot in common." Behind him, one of the men shifted his grip on the iron bar. The sound the metal made meeting his glove was very clear in the cold. Jack's mind lined options up and knocked them down 3 at a time. There was no good conversation to have here. There was only what got them to the truck alive with the evidence intact. He blinked once slow. Snow collected on his lashes and fell. He drew a breath and let it go. "Okay," he said. His voice came out even. "You want the camera catch?" He swung his hand up as if to toss, but the arc didn't end in a release. Instead, he snapped his wrist and flung a tight, hard handful of packed snow and ice chips straight into the nearest headlamp. The bulb didn't shatter, but the blaze of light exploded into a starburst glare. For 3 blinding seconds, the beam flared and refracted, turning the cold air itself into a white sheet. "Move," Jack barked. He seized Monroe's sleeve and cut right low and fast toward a line of scrub and a sagging fence that separated the drainage from a back pasture. Behind them, boots pounded, a voice barked something that might have been a curse or an order, and a flashlight beam skittered wide, chasing ghosts. They hit the fence at a dead run. Jack dropped to a knee, shoved a forearm through the weakest section, and ripped upward. Wood groaned. The top rail splintered with a noise like a gunshot. "Through," he hissed. Monroe slid on her hip and belly and was through, then twisted to grab the camera as Jack shoved it across. He followed the wood biting into his back as he squeezed under, then hauled the dangling rail back into place. It wouldn't slow anyone who really wanted through, but it might steal a second as pursuers chose a path. Left, Monroe said, already reading the terrain. The mounded pasture, there's a culvert. They ran at a crouch, breath-burning legs, protesting the lurching steps demanded by uneven frozen ground. The first heavy's flashlight found them for a second, painted their backs white, then slid away as Jack cut downhill into the shadow of a low embankment. A dry drainage cut through the pasture, more ditch than creek. Snow had drifted into it, but not sealed it. "Jump," Monroe asked. "Slide," Jack said, and dropped. The snow took him at the knees. Momentum carried him into a controlled sprawl that left him below grade, invisible from the trucks. Monroe landed beside him, already rolling to a knee. Voices above. "They're in the ditch," another voice, colder coal. "Cut them off at the road." 200 meters, Monroe said she hadn't needed to check. Her internal compass was better than any map. Truck. They moved, bent double in the ditch, using the cut banks as cover, then clambered out where the slope eased and sprinted the last 40 yards. The truck loomed like a friend called from a former life. Jack yanked the door open. In. They threw themselves onto the seat, and Jack twisted the key. The old engine coughed, staggered, caught. Headlights off, he dropped the shifter into reverse and tickled the gas. The truck rolled back onto the 2-track tires, finding the frozen ruts like rails. Jack spun the wheel, eased the clutch out, and pointed the nose toward the county road. Behind them, beams crashed across the field in angry geometry of light. A horn blared once, the sound didn't chase them far. Snow in the air and the roll of land swallowed sight fast. Jack kept his hands light and his nerves tight, letting the truck do what old trucks did, follow the path they knew. Only when the trees thickened around them and the land rose to hide the facility did he let the breath go that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Monroe stared straight ahead for several seconds, and the discipline in her posture only now fading at the edges. Then she pulled in air in a steady, conscious drag and let it out. "We have to talk about next steps," she said. "Talk," Jack said, eyes flicking between the ruts and the rear view. "I'll file an affidavit first thing," Monroe said. "The images you captured vents-barred windows, men with implements paired with the audio of hooves and distress vocalizations. It's a strong circumstantial package." She paused, the words as careful as the way she'd placed her feet on the approach. But a judge will want direct evidence that animals are being kept underground in illegal conditions, photos from inside, or a witness willing to testify to what's under that barn. How long for a warrant, Jack asked. Optimistic 2 to 3 days, she said. Realistic longer if Kane's people start whispering in ears. He's done that before. If we spook him, he'll move stock and he'll cull anything that slows him down. Cull, Jack repeated the word, tasting like something metallic. He could see Valor's legs in his mind. The rope burns the bruise lines. Cull meant bullets in heads and backhoes in the night. Monroe knew the thought he was following. I'm not saying wait and pray, she said. I'm saying if we do anything that looks like trespass before I have paper, we make it harder for a decent judge to help us later. But I also know the clock. So we need to pressure him without tipping him. Or we act outside the clean lines and live with the fallout. The road straightened. Jack let the truck creep up in speed, then eased off when the rear tires fishtailed. Snow hissed under the tread like wind over canvas. He remembered Valor leaning into the map, the way the horse's focus narrowed when the red door appeared. A picture in a mind that didn't think in words, repeating until he understood. He'd thought of that guidance as a strange trick at first. Now it felt like a message on a burning fuse. He's going to move them, Jack said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Monroe said. And he'll make sure nothing left behind can testify. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel until the stiff leather creaked. He loosened his grip and found his voice smooth when he spoke again. If you were me, if you had a source telling you exactly where the worst of it is, what would you do? Monroe looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were pale in the dim dash light, and for once not guarded. I would trust the source, she said. And then I would make sure I wasn't alone when I acted. Because if good people ever had a perfect moment to do the right thing, I've never met it. Jack nodded once. The wind picked up outside, dragging a hand along the truck's metal skin. The brush of sage on the undercarriage made a sound like whispering. They drove in silence the last mile to the county road. At the intersection, Jack stopped and let the engine idle. Snow haloed in the beams of a lone streetlight. 200 yards down, a tiny island of civilization in the dark. He could see Monroe's breath steady now, small clouds that rose and vanished. She said, when we get back, duplicate everything. Cloud drive 2 cards. Chain of custody on one set. The other is for insurance. And then you go home and you sleep a few hours. Not likely. You'll need your head, she said. He'll escalate. Jack gave a half smile that wasn't humor. So will we. Monroe didn't answer. She didn't need to. The decision had been made somewhere between the first barred window and the first set of headlights. All that remained was to admit it. They turned onto the county road and let the truck run. Fields flicked past black and white and black again. The sound of the engine was a comfort now, a heartbeat in metal. Monroe sat with her hands flat on her thighs, counting no doubt the ways this could go wrong, and the one way it had to go right. Jack kept seeing Valor in the barn, lifting his head at every engine's growl, ears pointing toward the dark. He thought of how the stallion had moved on 2 legs, because there had been no other choice, and how he'd looked at Jack in a storm and asked without words. He thought the asking isn't finished. The wind rose, racing the truck back toward the ranch. It moaned along the fences, combed the drifts, and filled the spaces between decisions with a thin, urgent sound, the sound of time running out. Jack reached the ranch well past midnight, the heater in the truck still humming as the headlights swung over the snow-dusted yard. The ride back from the county road had been silent, except for the low thrum of tires on ice. He'd planned to catch 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep before calling Monroe to work out their next move. The night felt like it had settled into itself, snow falling in lazy spirals, the wind a steady whisper through the bare cottonwoods along the fence line. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote barked once, and was answered by another farther off. It was the kind of winter quiet that made you believe nothing could shift until morning. Jack hung his coat by the door and stood for a moment in the kitchen, hands braced against the counter. His body ached with a dull heaviness that came after adrenaline had burned through and left him hollow. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, already imagining the bite of hot coffee. That was when it came, the sound that cut through the stillness like a blade ear. From the barn, Valor's whinny rose sharp and urgent. Not the easy rumble Jack knew from mornings when the stallion wanted to be let out, nor the impatient snort of a horse smelling feed. This was high-pitched, almost frantic, the kind of call that tightened your chest before you even realized you were moving. Jack's chair scraped against the floor. He yanked his coat back on, shoved his arms into the sleeves as he crossed the porch in 3 strides and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the wall hook by the door. The cold hit him hard, burning his nostrils, but Valor's voice was louder now, joined by the heavy pounding of hooves against wood. The beam of the flashlight cut a bright tunnel through the swirling snow as he jogged toward the barn. Inside, the air was warmer, thick, with the smell of hay and horse sweat. Valor was a storm contained in one stall. He spun tight circles, muscles standing out along his flanks, iron-shod hooves drumming on the planks. His ears were pricked so far forward they looked ready to tear from his head, his wide eyes locked on the south wall of the barn in the direction of Kane's property. Every few seconds, he stopped just long enough to slam a hoof down, then threw his head toward that invisible point in the distance and screamed another piercing whinny. Jack stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "Easy, boy. Easy." But the big Mustang didn't still. If anything, his agitation sharpened. He danced sideways, breath flaring in great clouds, then swung his head again toward the south, as if to say, "There. Look there." Jack reached the stall door and rested one hand on the top rail. "Valor, what is it?" He glanced over his shoulder into the night. Nothing but the soft hiss of snow against the barn wall. The stallion gave a short, sharp snort and pawed the floor. Then he lifted his head high and let out another call, longer this time, breaking into a half scream at the end. His body quivered with it. Jack had seen this before, horses sounding alarms when a predator came too close or when a member of their herd was in trouble. But here there were no cougars, no wolves, no other horses within sight. The thought came fast and unbidden. This isn't random. He remembered what Monroe had said, that Kane might move the horses to erase evidence before a warrant came through. That culling was likely for the weak or injured. Jack's mind jumped to the ventilation vents, the barred windows, the sound of hooves underground. Valor had been there. He'd smelled it, heard it, felt the fear. What if he knew the pattern of that place when activity started, when the men moved the stock? And what if right now that movement had begun? Jack took a step back, scanning the stallion's body language as if it were a coded signal. The repeated glances south, the urgency in each call, the restless stamping. These weren't random spasms. They were insistence. The stallion stopped pacing long enough to meet Jack's eyes. It wasn't the wide-eyed panic of prey. It was something more focused, more deliberate. Jack felt the hair on his arms rise despite the barn's heat. "You're telling me it's tonight, aren't you?" he murmured. Valor's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. He took a step toward the stall door, exhaled hard through his nostrils, and then jerked his head again toward the south. Jack's throat tightened. If Kane was loading horses now, they wouldn't wait for morning. By the time the first winter sun hit the snow, There might be nothing left to save, no living evidence, no injured Mustangs, nothing but empty stalls and the stink of bleach. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and hit Monroe's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice low and alert. "Jack, what's wrong?" He kept his words sharp and fast. "Valor's going crazy, stamping, calling, looking south. I've never seen him like this. If Kane's moving horses, I think it's happening right now." There was a pause long enough for him to hear the faint sound of papers rustling on her end. Then Monroe said, "If you're right tomorrow morning, we'll be too late." "I am right," Jack said. "I've worked with him long enough to know when he's spooked and when he's warning me. This isn't fear, it's a signal." Another pause. When Monroe spoke again, her voice had lost all hesitation. "All right. Meet me at the old cattle guard on the north fence line in 20 minutes. Bring whatever you think you'll need." "I'll be there," Jack said and ended the call. He checked his watch, 11:07. The night was slipping toward its darkest hours, the coldest part before dawn. If Kane's men were hauling trailers now, the work would be quick, quiet, and brutal. The weaker animals would be destroyed without ceremony. Jack's body was already moving. He strode to the tack room, slung a canvas satchel over one shoulder, and began loading it by rote spare flashlight batteries, a coil of soft rope, the small crowbar he'd used for fence repairs, a pair of gloves, thin enough to handle equipment, but thick enough to block cold. He hesitated by the gear rack, then grabbed a compact first aid kit and shoved it into the satchel. For the horses, if it came to that. Or for himself. From the wall peg, he took the lead rope he used for Valor, then doubled back to the stall. The stallion had stopped spinning but stood quivering, ears still fixed toward the south. Jack set the lead rope over the door and clipped it to the halter. "We're going out," he said. "And this time, it's not a drill." Valor dropped his head briefly, bumping it against Jack's shoulder with surprising gentleness. Then he lifted it again, eyes bright in the flashlight's glow, and gave a sharp, impatient snort. Jack smiled without humor. "Yeah," he said softly. "We're going to save your friends." The snow had thickened to a gauzy veil by the time Jack and Valor cleared the yard. They'd made it as far as the open gate when the stallion stopped so abruptly, the lead rope snapped taut in Jack's hand. Valor lifted his head high, nostrils flaring. For a heartbeat, the night held its breath. Then the Mustang sang. It wasn't a barn call or a feed-time nicker. It was a long, braided cry that rose from deep in his chest, climbed the cold air, and stretched until Jack felt it in his teeth. The sound threaded through the cottonwoods, bounced off the hard shoulders of the snow-slick hills, and came back in layered echoes that sounded like a chorus of other horses hidden just beyond sight. Jack's skin prickled beneath his coat. He'd heard stallions call before challenge claim alarm, but this had cadence like something memorized long ago and brought out only when it mattered. A signal. Valor held the last note until his whole frame quivered, and then dropped his muzzle and swung his ears south toward Kane's land before lifting his head and calling again. The second cry was different, shorter, sharper, 3 beats tight together, and then a fall-off as if punctuation. Jack couldn't help it. He laughed once under his breath, a sound of disbelief and awe. "What are you doing, boy?" he whispered. "Who were you talking to?" the night answered. At first, it was only a thread of sound, so faint Jack might have mistaken it for wind through wire. Then it thickened, grew into 2 voices, then 5, then more replies, thrown from different directions, some high and bright, others lower, rougher, all keyed to Valor's pattern. The hair on Jack's neck rose despite the cold. He lifted the flashlight out of reflex, but dimmed it with his gloved thumb so as not to blind what might be coming. The beam found the slope above the barn, and for a split second it caught movement shadow against shadow, compact bodies slipping along the hill's spine with the fluid certainty of animals that know every break in every fence. Shapes slid through the snow murk. Manes lifted and fell like black flames. Steam billowed from open mouths and flared off wide nostrils. They didn't thunder or scatter. They flowed deliberate, using the lay of the ground and the old cattle paths, as if they'd planned it at dawn. They did not rush Jack and Valor. Instead, the first of them fanned out in a wide arc around the barnyard. Noses raised, ears swiveling. A pale buckskin cut across the front pasture and took up a post facing the road. A bay mare drifted behind the equipment shed and vanished only to reappear farther down the fence, her silhouette carving against the snow. Two younger horses, shaggy with winter coats, planted themselves at the mouth of the driveway. Heads turned toward the county lane as if expecting trouble to arrive by engine. Within minutes, they had company. One by one, then two by two, the Mustangs gathered 11, 13, 15. They formed a loose ring around the yard, not crowding, never bunching each horse with clear space to pivot to run to charge if it had to. Their breath wrote soft ghosts in the air. A gray with a charcoal mane broke rank. It slid under the top rail of the old pipe corral and stepped into the barnyard as if it belonged there. Scar tissue pulling a thin white line across its left shoulder. The gray took 3 careful steps, stretched its neck, and touched noses with Valor through the gate, just a second and no more. A soft rasp of hair against hair breath, meeting breath. Valor answered with a short, throaty snort and a tiny shake of the head. Then he looked sideways at Jack. For a second, the absurdity of it stopped him. He's introducing us, Jack thought, and then immediately felt foolish for trying to wrap human words around something older and simpler. Whatever was happening between these animals wasn't a trick. It was a network scent-sound posture, a grammar of ears and weight shifts and shared memory. He took a step back and lowered the flashlight, letting the yard go dark again. If he'd learned anything these last days, it was that trust couldn't be forced. He could watch. He could keep the predators back. Beyond that, the horses would do what they had done long before fences and brand books. The ring around the yard reorganized itself almost imperceptibly. The buckskin at the road's mouth moved 10 feet to the left and tilted an ear to catch sound that hadn't yet arrived. The bay mare posted up near the barn's northern corner, her body angled to give her a straight line to the red-lit yard beyond the south hill, if she needed it. The gray with the scar didn't leave. It took up a position just outside the corral panel, shoulder to shoulder with Valor's own stance. Jack's breath fogged his scarf. "You didn't just call for company," he said, voice soft. "You called for backup." He felt foolish again, and then foolishness evaporated as the pattern clicked into place in his head. This wasn't random congregation. This was a perimeter. The stallion had not called to announce himself. He had sent a message in a language men once knew: danger? Come. Stand. And the wild had answered. The knowledge hit him in a rush that made his eyes sting. He'd been a Marine. He knew a perimeter when he saw one. He knew a watch when he saw a horse's ear fixed not on a sound, but on the possibility of a sound. A soft prickle of movement brushed Jack's sleeve. Valor had stepped closer, the lead rope slack as a piece of thread between them. The stallion's eye, dark and steady, held his a second longer than felt possible. And something in Jack, the part that had learned to read men in deserts and alleys, answered back without words. "If this is your team," he said, laying his hand along Valor's neck, feeling the thick winter coat under his palm, the heat of muscle, the contained energy of an animal that wants to move, "then we work with your team." Valor's ear flicked to him. and then forward again. Across the yard, as if in response, two horses lifted their heads and gave short, low calls, the kind that travel better close to the ground. The ring firmed, the line set. The night had changed shape. Jack pulled his phone with his free hand and thumbed to Monroe's number. She picked up half a ring in voice crisp and awake, as if she'd been standing by the door boots on bag in hand. "Tell me, you need to hear this," Jack said, and then realized the absurdity of that sentence, because the thing he needed to describe wasn't something a phone could carry. Valor called? Not to me. To them. Them. Monroe said, dry and skeptical in the way of people who keep their skepticism sharpened so they don't cut themselves on hope. To other Mustangs, Jack said. They're here. A lot of them. They fanned out around the yard. There was a beat of silence. How many is a lot? 12? 15? It's hard to count. They're not milling. They're posting, covering the road, the fences. They're acting like a herd that knows it's on the edge of a fight. Another breath's worth of quiet. When Monroe spoke again, the skepticism hadn't vanished, but it had stepped aside to let something else through. Whether they're here for romance or war, she said it might be the only distraction we ever get. We use what we have. Jack felt stupidly like laughing. He swallowed it. We said north fence, he reminded her. Cattle guard? 20 minutes. Make it 30, Monroe said. I'm moving a piece on my side. Her voice dipped lower. And Jack, don't ride this like a rodeo stunt. If those horses will follow your lead, keep them clear of bullets. The rest we can handle. Copy, Jack said, because old habits die last. He ended the call and pushed the phone deep into his pocket, and then turned a slow circle memorizing the positions of the animals at the yard's edge. He didn't know their names and never would, but in this moment, he knew their jobs. The gray with the scar drew a breath and let it out in a long, quiet sigh. Valor answered with a short grunt. There was no fear in it. There was readiness. Jack tightened the cinch on the lightweight saddle and looped an extra rope around the horn. He checked the flashlight batteries with a tap, and a twist felt the comforting weight of the small crowbar in his coat pocket, then clipped the lead rope to Valor's halter with a soft snick of metal on metal. Come on, he said. We've got to move before sarcasm sets in. They set out at a low jog across the pasture, Valor's hooves whispering through powder. The herd didn't follow en masse. That would have been a stampede. Instead, 5 peeled off in a loose wedge, Valor at the point, because there was no arguing with him, and Jack didn't try. The rest stayed to their posts, ears canted toward the county road and the South Hill sentries at a fort whose stones were flesh and bone. The path to the north fence cut through a shallow swale where wind piled snow into scallop drifts. The mounded earth hid them from the road. Jack kept to the low spine of the ground, moving with the old ghost of patrol discipline. Don't silhouette yourself. Don't shine. Don't let your breath turn to steam at the wrong angle, where a floodlight might catch it. The night had that special cold that eats sound. Even the horses' footfalls were small thumps in wool. But when they reached the cattle guard iron bars, black with frost, Monroe's shape detached from the shadow of a stunted cottonwood. She wore a dark parka and a knit cap pulled low, the camera bag bumping at her hip, one gloved hand raised in a silent greeting. Her breath steamed once and then was gone. She took 2 steps and stopped dead. Jesus, she whispered, because the 5 Mustangs had not shied or blown at her. They'd posted themselves at the edges of the swale like soldiers taking corners, one watching the lane, one. The open pasture 2 angled toward the ranch lights. Valor stood between Jack and Monroe, head high, the rope loose enough to be an ornament. Monroe's mouth did a small thing that might have been a smile, There might have been a grimace at her own surprise. "You weren't kidding," she said. "Wish I was," Jack said. Monroe glanced at her watch, then at the sky, a long look that measured the dark and counted backward from dawn. "Before morning," she said, "that's when people start making mistakes. And if Cain's moving animals, he'll do it now to give himself daylight at the far end." Jack nodded. North approach," she confirmed. "You take the dry drainage right up to the fence. There's a culvert under the perimeter on that side big enough to crawl too small for a quad. It drops you behind the equipment shed. If you hug the wall of the west paddock and keep the low ground, you can get to the red door without ever crossing the pole light's cores. And you, Monroe, touch the camera bag at her hip. I stay high and document everything. If it goes quiet, I call it in, and we bring the county and the feds and anyone else with a badge and a warrant that doesn't leak. If it goes loud..." Her eyes flicked to Valor and the 4 other horses. "I make a lot of noise in the right places and pray the cavalry knows its cues." Jack didn't ask how she planned to make noise. He suspected that, like him, she had things in the truck that weren't exactly field issue but did the job. He crouched at the edge of the drainage and checked the snow fill for tracks, traps, anything that would trip a man moving too fast. Smooth. The culvert mouth was a black circle cut into the fence line, rimmed in ice. Wind had drifted snow across part of it, but a kick and a pull cleared a belly crawl's worth of space. He looked back to the Mustangs. "Here's the play," he said, and felt insane for a second, because he was about to brief wild horses. 5 at the front with Valor. "Make them see you. Scream the sky down. If they chase you, you run them east away from the trucks. The rest of you..." He swept a hand toward the shapes in the pasture that hadn't followed and realized they likely didn't need his instruction at all. "You hold the edges. If anything comes from the lane, you become ghosts. Don't get penned." The horses didn't stamp or whinny. They simply watched him the way men once did when they were tired of pep talks and ready to work. He touched Valor's neck. "You lead. When I give you the cue, you take the front and you take the noise. Don't run the fence. You'll cut your legs. Keep them moving but not too scared. We're not breaking gates. We're borrowing attention." Valor bobbed his head once. Jack could have sworn it was assent. They waited. The sky over the hills had that pre-dawn bruise to it, a faint colorless, not quite light that told the body it had been up too long. Somewhere behind the red barn's far side, a generator coughed and then settled. A door slammed. Voices carried thin across the hard yard. Jack's instrument brain counted the distance and drew triangles around sounds. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and let his heartbeat find the steady beat it had learned each time he'd stood behind a wall, listening for footsteps on the other side. "Now," Monroe said softly. Jack tapped Valor's shoulder. The stallion surged not with panic, but with purpose. He and the 5 broke from the swale as a unit spilling like ink across the pale pasture. They hit the open ground at a long trot that looked like a gallop in the near dark, then spread at the last second into a fan that slammed to a halt in front of the perimeter fence. Valor reared just enough to strike the ground with his forefeet when he came down. He screamed high, piercing not fear, but challenge. The others answered, circling tight bodies, heaving steam hooves, drumming. They didn't hit the fence. They hit the space around it the way a firestorm hits air, and that was enough. Light exploded across the yard. Floods flared into full burn. The red door banged open and 2 men burst out, one already cursing the other, lifting a flashlight that went useless in the wash. "God, get those damn things out of here," someone shouted from inside. A third man on the corner started toward the gate at a half-run, fumbling with keys, radio crackling at his shoulder. Jack slid into the drainage and became part of the ground. The culvert was tight, slick along the steel ribs, stinging cold where ice kissed his cheek. He pulled with his elbows and pushed with his toes, keeping the bag on his chest and the crowbar tucked along his forearm to stop it clanking on metal. The echo of hooves and shouts overhead masked the scrape of his coat against frost. He came out in shadow. The equipment shed's back wall was 10 feet to his right, in the west paddock, a low stretch of pipe and boards to his left. He hugged the shed, moved to the corner, and peeked. The floodlights made hard cones that just missed the space between shed and paddock, a mercy no one had intended. He slid into it, keeping his shoulders turned to make himself thinner. Breath a slow, controlled sieve through scarf and teeth. He could see the red door now across 100 feet of hard-packed ground, flat paint keypad beside the jammed security camera, hooded against the weather. 2 men had reached the gate and were already yanking chain through a pipe gap to swing it wide, yelling and slapping at the air with their arms, as if that had ever moved a horse that didn't want moving. The 5 Mustangs danced just beyond reach, flaring their nostrils and stamping at frozen dirt, not touching fence, not giving anyone an excuse to shoot. Somewhere above Jack, high on the hill, maybe in the notch by the cottonwood, Monroe's camera made its dampened chick-chick as it ate the scene. Jack moved when the men moved, when the one with the radio turned his back to shout, when the other dropped the chain by accident and swore when a third came out of the red door with a long stick, and then stopped to squint at the chaos as if his eyes could fix it by focus alone. He reached the red door and flattened himself against the wall. Up close, the paint was pitted where wind-blown grit had been sandblasting it all winter. The keypad was standard ranch-grade metal faceplate, rubbery black buttons, no smudge pattern worth reading in this cold. He glanced up at the camera bubble under its hood. The lens pointed high, meant to catch faces coming in and not hands pressed flat to the panel right under it. He slid the small crowbar out of his sleeve and touched its cold edge to the door seam testing. He didn't want to pry too loud. He wanted leverage when the moment offered it. Out in the yard, Valor bellowed again. The note pitched different, a rip of sound that made even Jack's trained nerves jolt. Guards swore. A metal bucket clattered. Somewhere too close, a horse squealed and then settled, the sound of fear pushed down by something steadier. Jack put his mouth close to the door seam and listened. Under the generator's cough and the men's boots and the outside noise, he heard it, the close, damp breath of a dozen lungs in a space too small. The clink of chain against bar, the wet scrape of a hoof on concrete, and closest, another noise he recognized with a chill of fury. A man's voice, low and ugly, saying, "We'll move the good ones. The rest, same as last time." Jack's hands shook once. He let the anger wash through and past and be gone, leaving only the ice of intent. He eased the crowbar into the seam at knee height, where the steel was least reinforced, and waited for the next shouted distraction, for the next punch of sound to cover a tiny complaint of metal giving way. "Come on," he breathed, not to the door, not even to himself, but to whatever strange alliance of wild horse and wild weather and human stubbornness had brought him to this exact square foot of Wyoming dirt. Behind him, the yard erupted as another gate banged open, and the 5 Mustangs wheeled as one splitting left and right to draw guards into 2 directions at once. Jack leaned his weight into the bar and felt the door flex. The crowbar bit. The red door flexed with a tired groan, metal complaining against weather and use. Jack leaned once more, timing the push to the chorus, outside Valor's razor-edged scream boots pounding a shouted order, and the latch popped. The door jumped an inch and coughed out a smell that hit like a slap ammonia iron mildew, the stale heat of bodies stacked in air, not meant for breath. He slipped inside and eased the doors shut to a finger's width, enough to keep the floodlight's glare from knifing down the stairwell. The beam of his flashlight painted steel steps going steeply down a handrail tacky with rust. Beneath the fan's industrial hum came the sounds he'd heard with his ear at the seam hooves skidding on concrete chain on ring, an exhausted, throttled whinny that made his teeth clench. "Easy," he whispered to no one and everyone, and began to descend. The light caught the ceiling first, old low-hung with flickering industrial bulbs that turned the air a weary yellow. Then bars. A row, then two rows, welded panels making narrow stalls along both sides of a central alley. Each stall was the size of a walk-in closet. Each held a horse. They stared out at him with the flat, guarded eyes of animals conditioned to expect pain. Some flinched from the light, tucking their muzzles to their chests, chains clicking against steel as the movement hit limits. A bay's hip showed a fresh welt blood, beaded along the edge in a trembling line. A dun's ribs bowed like old barrel staves under hide. A small roan, a mare he thought cut down with hunger, lifted a forefoot and set it down again and again, each touch of hoof to concrete, making a dull, heartbroken tick. "Hey," Jack said, voice low and steady the way his drill sergeant had told him to speak to men bleeding out and boys panicking in dust. "Hey there. I see you. I've got you." He moved to the first stall, finding a heavy snap link threaded through a ring in the floor chain to a cuff around the foreleg. His bolt cutters were a memory rusted in some past life. But on a wall just past the stairs hung tools that did not belong in a barn, the kind of cutters used to bite padlocks off shipping crates. He took them down and tested the hinge, then knelt. The bay's ears flicked. Jack put his palm to the horse's neck, felt the tremor there spoke nonsense in a soothing rhythm while he lifted the chain with his other hand. The cutter's bit squealed and then punched through. The mare jerked. The cuff clanked free and skittered. Jack backed a step, showing open hands. "Up," he murmured, because the alley ended in a ramp on the far side, rubber-matted narrow, angled toward a freight hatch he hadn't seen from outside. Up and out. Go. The bay stalled a heartbeat, eyes locked to his then shouldered past, nearly brushing him into the bars, and found the ramp. In 2 strides, she was climbing head-low legs, clumsy but determined. At the top she paused, nostrils flaring toward the pale seam of dawn under the hatch. And then she was gone into the noise. Jack moved, stall to stall, his world narrowing to metal and breath and the sharp jolt that traveled up his arms each time the cutters severed a chain. He learned quickly which horses needed a touch and which needed only room. He learned the sounds their bodies made when hope arrived, tiny changes in breath, a different set to ears, the first fragile forward step. "Go on," he told a big sorrel whose eyes had fixed on him like anchors. "Go meet the sky. He's calling you." Valor's voice burst faintly down the stairwell, as if to make the point. The sorrel surged. He was halfway down the second row when the stair treads above him started ringing. Not the light clatter of a guard at a trot, but the deep, confident thump of boots coming hard and sure. Jack stepped into the nearest stall mouth and let the shadow take him as the first man hit the concrete and kept moving. Silas Kane didn't look like a myth or a monster. He looked like money in a cheap coat, expensive boots, a clean shave that made his mouth seem crueler. A handgun darkened his fist. Behind him came Cole Barrett, iron bar, in one-hand eyes already scanning for violence. Rourke Kane said, his voice soft and cooled by contempt. "What a disappointment. I thought you'd be smarter than to break into my property." Jack didn't bother answering. He took in 2 things, the side door at the far end of the alley, a maintenance exit, probably the handle polished by habit, and the way Kane drifted sideways toward it, putting Cole in front like a shield. Cole's smile crept. "You should have turned me away when you had the chance," he said. "Would have been cleaner." "That an apology?" Jack asked. "Consider it a courtesy." Jack's fingers tightened on the cutters. He felt the old contained calm spread through him, the one that left room for observation and left no room for fear. Kane flicked his gun barrel toward the stalls. "Put the toys down and back away," he said, voice low, with the confidence of men who've never been stopped. "You're leaving with broken fingers either way. The choice is whether you leave at all." From the corner of his eye, Jack saw the movement first, an ache in the air, a shift of shadow where the wall met a narrower corridor he hadn't yet explored. He didn't look directly. He kept his eyes on Kane's hands, because guns are hands more than metal, and he said almost conversationally, "You should work on your perimeters." What valor came like a thrown spear. There must have been a stock ramp down that passage. There must have been a gap in a human thought of as too tight for a horse. But a Mustang is not furniture, and fear is a solvent. The stallion burst from the side chute at a slant. His shoulder hit Cole with a bone-deep thud that drove the air out of the man in a guttering grunt, and the iron bar went clanging into the alley. Cole pinwheeled into the bars of an empty stall. The sound he made was wet and surprised. The entire room reacted as if it had been struck horses, rearing chains, rattling the fan's drone, swallowed in a single ragged roar of movement and voice. Kane's gun jerked up and Jack moved. He didn't run at Kane. He ran at the nearest stall and slammed the bolt cutters through the chain. Out he shouted, and the mare within bolted past him like a tide. The next stall cut shove release. Valor wheeled teeth bared and planted himself between Kane's line of sight and Jack's exposed back. "Shoot it," Cole choked, staggering for the fallen bar. Kane didn't. He'd seen enough animals die to know what happens when bullets fly in enclosed spaces full of panicked flesh. He took 3 quick steps backward toward the maintenance door mouth, a hard slice gun tracking Mustang and man in tight arcs. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You'll drown under paperwork while I move everything worth moving." Valor struck the concrete with one forefoot in a warning that carried up Jack's spine like electricity. Jack cut the last chain in the row. The Duns scrambled and fled, scrambling up the rubber toward dawn. In the eye blink of space that opened, Kane took his chance. He snapped the small door open, slid through, and slammed it behind him. The lock clacked. Cole lunged. Valor met him head-on, chest to chest, enough force to send the bigger man folding sideways once more into bars, then collapsing hard onto the concrete. The iron bar spun again, rattled, settled. The stallion snorted once, a sound of bright, uncompromising fury, then swung his head to Jack. "Time to go," Jack said, as if Valor hadn't just saved his life. He swept his light once along the alley to make sure he'd freed every stall. Chains lay like broken punctuation on the floor. In the far corner, a roan stood trembling, too frightened to move. Jack paired his body to her shoulder and pressed until she took the step for herself, and then another, and then she was climbing hip bones like wings under hide. He turned for the stairs. Valor stayed glued to his shoulder, big body careful on the narrow treads, breath a hot engine at Jack's ear. Above dawn thinned the dark into something almost blue. Outside, the yard's chaos had changed, timbre shouts, sharper metal, smashing metal horses' voices, cutting in and out like sirens. At the top landing, Jack spared one look back down the stairwell at the room of cages he'd emptied. It smelled like the inside of a wound, but the sound had changed. It wasn't the low moan of captivity anymore. It was the clatter of exit, the clumsy, beautiful thunder of getting out. Up, Jack said again, and they hit the light. The yard was a riot when he stepped into it. The Mustangs Valor had summoned were a circling storm and the world's oldest cavalry hooves drumming a controlled chaos that split guards and scattered attention like chaff. Horses from Kane's own pens had caught the panic and flipped it into movement. Troughs lay on their sides, water frozen into fans, where it splashed and then seized in the air. Jack put 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a whistle sharp enough to cut glass. The horses he'd freed bucked into daylight from the ramp, and the red door wildness returning to their bodies with every step forward. He steered them with his own position and a raised arm, pushing them into the wide ring the Mustangs had left as a lane. They merged, found a cadence, became not prey in flight, but mass in motion. Back a guard yelled, waving a length of PVC like it could stop weather. Back you. He never finished the sentence. A bay mare shouldered past him, not crushing, not killing, but a deliberate declaration of space. The man stumbled, dropped his improvised staff, and chose life over pride, sprinting for the side of a truck. Rourke Kane's shout came from the north side of the yard, the maintenance route he'd used to flee the hothouse below. He strode into the open with his pistol leveled, 2 men flanking him. His face had purged of color. What remained was a furious heat that made him look younger and softer and much more dangerous. No one leaves this property, he barked. Not you, not them. Jack didn't slow. Valor slid between him and the firearm, placing his body on a line that turned the handgun's clean path into a problem. The stallion's ears flattened. Steam roared from his nostrils. His eyes flashed like wet obsidian. Move, Kane said, fixing the front sight on the Mustang's chest. Put the gun down, Jack shouted over the churn. You fire into this yard and you kill your own men before you touch us. Kane took a step. The 2 with him fanned to widen angles. One had a taser, the other had a short scattergun held too high and too loose. And then the new sound arrived all at once. Sirens, not the thin rise of county cruisers, but the lower throbbing whoop-whoop of federal SUVs. Red and blue broke over the top of the gate and skipped like lightning along the sheet metal. Engines roared. Tires bit ice. Lights turned the yard into a carnival no one wanted. Federal agents, Claire Monroe's voice cracked across the scene sharp through a loudhailer. Drop your weapons, hands where we can see them, and the gate didn't open. It exploded in chain-snapping hinges, giving under deliberate impact. Black trucks and tan county pickups poured through in a tide. Men and women in heavy vests flowed in behind doors, taking quick, trained knee-sight line sectors, the geometry of a clean assault written across the yard in seconds. Kane pivoted, counting odds, calculating angles. For once he was slow. One of the Mustangs, shaggy dark, smaller than Valor and quicker, took advantage of the beat of confusion and slammed a shoulder into the henchman with the scattergun. The man's feet skated. The gun popped from his hands and slithered away across the ice. He grabbed air, sat down hard, and had a federal knee in his back a second later. Cole Barrett Monroe's voice again this time, with the special steel she kept for names. On your face, hands out, Cole, clutching his ribs by the red door, tried to push to his feet. A deputy filled his world, and then the cuffs did cold and absolute. Kane's gun didn't lower. It rose. A laser dot from an agent's carbine walked up his chest to the notch at his throat. Don't, Monroe said. And this wasn't loud-hailered. It was personal. She had stepped into the open vest, snug over her jacket, hair pulled back, badge bright. Put it down, Silas. You're done. For a second, one vicious, stupid second, Kane thought about shooting a federal agent in front of cameras and horses and God. Then he showed a flicker of intelligence and let the pistol fall. It hit the ice, bounced once, and a boot pinned it. Hands rose, zip ties bit. The empire he'd built on steel and fear made a small clatter when it landed. Monroe didn't waste the air. Teams 1 and 2 down the rabbit hole, she said, voice gone workmanlike again. Body cams on record, everything. Vet teams on me. We triage in the yard and move the worst first. Agents flowed to the red door, disappeared down the heat-steep stairwell. Others fanned to the trucks, flipping open tarps, revealing cages that should never have been there, stacking crates for dogs, modified for horses, too small and too cruel. Cameras caught it all, the chains in piles, the welts, the bits wired to tighten the ledger books. In an office with a safe already yawning where someone had been hurriedly packing guilt in paper form. Monroe went horse to horse, moving with efficient tenderness, her gloved hands quick and gentle on raw skin. "Get me a sling here," she called. "And then this one's got a puncture along the fetlock, wrap and load." She met Jack's eyes once as a team led a trembling roan toward a trailer bed padded with straw. "You did good," she said, and then turned to shout another order. The yard began to transform. What had been a battlefield became a triage tent without the tent. Federal and county worked side by side, roping lanes, guiding animals, interviewing a foreman who'd suddenly found religion. Reporters summoned by scanners and texts gathered beyond the fence lenses, fogging in their own breath. Dawn crept over the shoulder of the hill and laid a pale hand on everything ugly the lights revealed. Someone read Kane his rights. The words sounded worn, but the cuffs on his wrists were brand new. Monroe walked back to Jack when the worst of the torrent had eased and the first trailer doors clanged shut on the soft thud of straw and the slower sigh of bodies settling. She held out her hand. He took it. Her grip was dry and strong. "If not for you and that horse," she said, "no performance in it, only fact, we would have been too late." Jack glanced at Valor, who stood with his head high and his winter coat steamed to darkness, eyes still burning but calmer now that the noises had changed shape. The stallion shook mane tossing, then placed himself shoulder to shoulder with Jack like a friend who plans to stay. Jack laid his palm along the warm arc of neck and said, "He led me. I just opened doors." Valor blew a soft, almost amused snort, as if to say, even that was debatable. By full daylight, yellow tape crisscrossed the fences, and paper seals fluttered on the office door where agents had already bagged hard drives and hard truths. The red door stood open, its paint dull and mourning a wound about to be sutured shut for good. By noon, a convoy pulled onto the county road and turned toward town, white vet vans and stock trailers with heaters humming, each carrying animals who had learned in a single hour that the world could change. They went east to the Wyoming Wild Mustang Rescue and Conservancy, a low complex of barns and paddocks spread along a ridgeline that caught the best sun. The loading bays were ready when the first trucks reversed into place. Volunteers in layered coats and bright hats took positions, passing along leads and blankets, calling out numbers and names that hadn't been earned yet, but would be. Inside the intake barn, the air was warm and smelled of iodine and hay. A line of exam stations had been set up under heat lamps, scale thermometer hydration checks, quick blood draws for disease panels. Wounds were flushed and wrapped injections given, teeth checked with headlamps and practiced hands. Valor drew looks when he stepped off the trailer because he was beautiful despite the scars, and because he walked like a creature who knew things, and because he didn't so much as flick an ear at the bustle. Emily Hayes was there with a stethoscope looped around her neck, hair stuffed under a beanie face lit with the focused calm of people doing the work they were made to do.